Good afternoon, class. I'm sorry I couldn't be there today. However, I am at Yosemite Park in California. I'm attending a conference, big communication conference. It's hosted by Dr. Tiffany Bell. You might have heard of her. Couldn't miss this conference. So today I'm actually going to talk to you guys about rhetoric. So before I get into that, the big question I want to ask you guys is, how many of you have a fear of public speaking? Now, chances are most of you do. It's actually found in a study recently that more Americans would rather go into a life-threatening situation than actually have to public speak, if that's a verb, whatever. So, now the fear of public speaking is actually very common, but public speaking is very essential to several parts of our daily lives. And rhetoric today, what we're talking about, is actually focused on public speaking. So the rhetoric is actually consists of 3 books. Now these 3 books were written by Aristotle, a Greek philosopher. I'm sure many of you have heard of him. The first book was written about public speakers, the second, the audience, which is very important, and the third, the speech itself. Now, way back in time, when Aristotle wrote this, he was studying under Plato. Now, Plato was kind of obsessed with searching for absolute truths. He always wanted to find the absolute truth. Meanwhile, Aristotle was a little bit more practical. He kind of wanted to deal with the here and now. He wanted to attain a logical, realistic, and rational view of society. So at this point in history, it was really common for citizens, obviously usually men at the time, required to speak in public. And they would go to these men they called sophists. And these sophists were teachers of public speaking, essentially. And they would instruct these people on the basic principles of Aristotle. So in response to that, on the very principles of persuasion. So in response to that, Aristotle wrote the Rhetoric, those 3 books that I mentioned. And these were kind of his response to the problems that he saw in the handbooks written by these sophists. So here he defined rhetoric as the available means of persuasion, which is very important. Now, he also said that we need to consider all aspects of speech making, especially our audience, when we're writing a speech. So we have 2 assumptions here. The first is that effective public speakers must consider the audience. This is key to rhetoric. So by doing this, we engage in audience analysis. This is the process of evaluating an audience and its background and tailoring your speech so that the listeners respond to how you want them to. Our next assumption is that effective public speakers employ a number of proofs in their presentations. Now these are boiled down to 3 terms. We have ethos, logos, and pathos. Ethos are our perceived character, intelligence, and goodwill of our speaker that we reveal through our speech. Next, we have logos. Easy way to remember this. Logos, logical. This is our logical proof that you're going to employ in your arguments through rationalizations. You're going to use logical claims, such as statistics, blah, blah, blah. And then lastly, we have pathos, which is our emotional appeals. This is like the ASPCA commercials, you always see those. So I'm going to send you guys over to my colleague over in Paris, France. She's going to give you the lowdown on the canons of rhetoric. Bye-bye.
Bonjour class, je m'appelle Amanda. There are 5 canons of rhetoric, and the first one is intervention. Intervention pertains to the construction or development of an argument related to a particular speech. So it's a body of information and knowledge that a speaker is bringing to the speaking situation. So in other words, you're using logic and evidence in which it makes the speech more powerful and more persuasive. Aids to invention are identified as topics, and topics are an aid to invention that refer to the arguments the speaker uses. So this helps enhance the speaker's persuasiveness. So speakers look to what are called civic spaces, and civic spaces are a metaphor suggesting that speakers have locations where the opportunity to persuade others exists. So in other words, you're doing absolutely everything you can to ensure that you are persuading your audience. The second canon identified by Aristotle is called arrangement. Arrangement pertains to the speaker's ability to organize a speech. So Aristotle says that we need to follow these organizational strategies for our speeches to be more effective. So he says that we should generally follow what is called a threefold approach, and a threefold approach consists of an introduction, a body, and conclusion. And all of us know what an introduction, a body, and conclusion are, but however, we're going to go over it anyway. It's kind of common sense, but an introduction gains your audience's attention. So right off the bat, you want to connect with your audience and kind of share that emotional side. The body includes all your arguments, supporting ideas, and necessary examples. And he states that the audience needs to be led from one point to another for the speech to be effective. And lastly, your conclusion. It's kind of a wrap up. It summarizes all your points and arousing emotions. And all of these bolsters speaker credibility, enhances persuasiveness, and reduces listener frustration. The third canon of rhetoric is called style. Style includes use of language to express ideas in a speech. So he states that this includes word choice, word imagery, and word appropriateness. So he says that rhetoric has its own style and that we should avoid strange words or outdated words. These are called glosses. Glosses, like I said, are outdated words which turn people off. So example, you wouldn't say colored people. It's just weird. You wouldn't say it. And then he talks about metaphors, which is a figure of speech that helps us to make the unclear more understandable. So metaphors have capacity to change perceptions and minds of listeners. The fourth canon of rhetoric is memory, and all of these are exactly how they sound, but memory is storing information in your mind. So when you go up to present your speech, you want to have things in your head. You don't want to be reading from a piece of paper or a note card the entire time. However, you're still allowed to do so. You know, if you go up to make a speech, you want to have things in your mind, but you also want to be able to look over your notes too as well to kind of remind you of things that you want to say. Aristotle reminds us to consider a number of issues prior to the presentation, things like example, science, metaphor, delivery techniques, etc., etc. This will ease the speaker's anxiety and allows the speaker to respond to unanticipated
So
last but not least, we have delivery, and delivery is kind of, the crucial canon of rhetoric. It's a presentation of your speech, and your speech, all your ideas kind of coming together. Delivering an effective speech complements the speaker's words and helps reduce anxiety. Aristotle says, be natural when you're delivering your speech. He says that normally, when you think of delivering a speech, you want to include a host of behaviors. You want to have eye contact, vocal cues, pronunciation, enunciation, dialect, body movement, physical appearance, etc. However, he doesn't focus so much on that. He focuses more on the manipulation of your voice. So he says that you should have good pitch, rhythm, volume, and emotion when you're delivering your speech. Like I said, being natural. And this concludes with a discussion of 3 types of rhetoric, which my colleague from Hawaii will go over. Bonjour.
Aloha! My name is Jessica Mitchell, and I am in Hawaii. I'm going to talk about the types of rhetoric today, the tradition, the approach to knowing, and the communication context. So, there are 3 different types of rhetoric: forensic, epidictic, and deliberative. So, forensic rhetoric is a type of rhetoric that pertains to speakers prompting feelings of guilt or innocence to an audience. So this could be in a courtroom with the defendant trying to proclaim that they are innocent, or maybe they say that they're guilty, and they have to persuade their case, whatever it may be. So epidictic rhetoric is a type of rhetoric that pertains to praising or blaming. And an example of this would be ceremonial speaking. So say someone graduates and there's an honorary speaker, that's a ceremony where someone would speak. Or say there's a funeral, that's also a type of ceremony. A family member might get up there and speak about their loved one who has passed. And finally, deliberative rhetoric. This is a type of rhetoric that determines an audience's course of action. An example of this right now would be political speaking. So, presidential candidates trying to speak to voters and persuade them to vote for them, and then they have a call to action. You know, if you want this change, vote for me on this day. That's an example of deliberative rhetoric. Okay, so the communication tradition for rhetoric is rhetorical. The communication context is public/rhetorical. And the approach to knowing is interpretive and critical. Interpretive is an approach viewing truth as subjective and stressing the participation of the researcher in the research process. An example of why rhetoric is interpretive: the audience can interpret the speaker's persuasive techniques however they choose. They may interpret it completely different than how the speaker intended them to. And it could be considered critical because the audience can criticize the speaker's persuasion methods. And on to critique. Okay, so for the critiques, we have logical consistency, heroism, and test of time. Logical consistency is a criterion for evaluating theories, which refers to the internal logic in theoretical statements. This can relate back to rhetoric as a critique, because Aristotle's theory of rhetoric is derived from his lecture notes, which can be seen as unorganized and just kind of scattered all over the place. Heroism is a criterion for evaluating theories, which refers to the amount of research and new thinking stimulated by the theory. This relates so well to rhetoric because public speaking is derived from Aristotle's theory of rhetoric. And lastly, test of time. This theory has been around for so long. It was generated 2,000 years ago, so it has definitely been able to withstand the test of time. So that concludes our presentation on rhetoric. I hope you enjoyed it, and thank you all so much for watching.